Rachel Holt for Nesson.com here with Ryan Fowler of Fox Sports. Thanks for tuning in to our fantasy football chat. And Ryan, if you can believe it, we're at the halfway point of the NFL season. So to start off this talk, let's recap what happened in weeks 1 through 8. First off, in the fantasy football world, what were the biggest surprises for you?
Well, I want to start with the zero RB strategy. And, a lot of people have really embraced it. And a lot of people still don't know exactly what it's all about. So the zero RB strategy is basically you wait on drafting a running back. You load up on wide receivers in those first 3 to 4 rounds, maybe pick up a Gronkowski, a Jordan Reed, a Greg Olsen at tight end, and maybe your quarterback. And then you pay attention to the fantasy running back situations, and it's working. Look at the running backs that were drafted last or towards the back end. DeMarco Murray, Melvin Gordon, Matt Forte, the forgotten man. Those guys are performing above average when you look at all the injuries for running backs this year and some of the guys that have been, again, disappointments. But again, DeMarco Murray and his rebirth there in Tennessee, I think, is one of the best stories in fantasy football this year. He's definitely been one of the most consistent running backs. And when you look at those RBs and all those injuries, we go back to week 2 and how many running backs got hurt and have been on the mend. I mean, we still don't have Doug Martin back. Adrian Peterson probably isn't back until December. And you just go down the list. Danny Woodhead goes to IR. You have all these guys. And then you have guys like Matt Forte, DeMarco Murray, Melvin Gordon is probably one of the biggest surprises. He didn't score last year. And then this year, he's even against the Denver Broncos in week 8, one of the best performances out of a running back this week. Great story. Another surprise is the lack of depth at wide receiver. We can go over the Mike Evans, the Amari Coopers, the AJ Green, Julio Jones, and the guys that were supposed to do well are doing well. But after you hit a certain tier, it's kind of this roller coaster of who's going to step up this week? Because again, for a little bit, it was Will Fuller in Houston. Another week, it'll be Doug Baldwin. But you're not getting that consistent production out of other wide receivers after you lose that first tier. So that's kind of surprising. I think in the past, we've looked at the depth of wide receivers and said, I feel good about this guy or that guy at my wide receiver 2, and we're going to make it work week in and week out. The final guy I want to kind of mention is Jamison Crowder, and we'll talk about waiver wires probably here in a little bit, but Jamison Crowder's potential there in Washington, I think, is on the rise. Deshaun Jackson, shocker, can't stay healthy, and we have Jordan Reed, but I think Jamison Crowder, if you look at his game logs over the last month plus, one of the most consistent fantasy wide receivers in terms of double-digit fantasy production week in and week out. And I don't think anybody back in August was saying, Jamison Crowder, that's somebody I want to add on my team. So he's one of the biggest surprises as of late, where you look at his entire body of work and say, this could work.
Well, Ryan, you mentioned some of the disappointments, whether they were guys we drafted high up there that got injured, or just guys that haven't been performing to their abilities. For you, who are some names that are the biggest disappointments so far through the first 8 weeks?
Well, the names that keep popping up during the fantasy chats at Fox Sports are Allen Robinson and DeAndre Hopkins, and sometimes in the same sentence. We'll start with DeAndre Hopkins. It's not his fault. Brock Osweiler isn't a great quarterback. And I think from a week in, week out consistency standpoint, it's two things. Brock isn't as great of a quarterback as maybe the Texans thought he was, and they're running the ball a ton. That's how Lamar Miller hurt himself and was kind of less than 100% going into week 8. I think you have to be really careful to say DeAndre Hopkins is down and out, because at any given time, I still think he can be a wide receiver 2 in your lineup. So just the knee-jerk reaction to say, I'm dropping DeAndre Hopkins because I want to be rid of the headache, isn't the best strategy. I still think there's going to be an owner out there that may give you 60 cents on the dollar in a trade for DeAndre Hopkins on the off chance that he can get 11 to 15 fantasy points. I think his ceiling of what was 30-plus fantasy points is gone. With Brock there, it just doesn't make good sense to invest in DeAndre as a top-tier wide receiver anymore because of Brock and because of the running game and how much of a focus that is. Not to mention, C.J. Fedorowicz has been so good in that tight end role in the last month. The other guy, Allen Robinson, and this is where I think you don't hit the panic button. I think DeAndre, that's a panic situation. I think Allen Robinson, and the way that the Jaguars are looking right now, Allen Robinson can go out there and score you 25-plus fantasy points on any given week with Blake Bortles. The Jaguars just made an offensive coordinator coaching change, firing Olsen. So we might see a different look Jaguars the rest of the way. And I'm going to guess, based on what worked last year, is that they're going to try and get Allen Robinson the ball a little bit more. Marquise Lee can't be your leading receiver. Allen Hurns and Allen Robinson need to be working in conjunction with some type of running game. TJ Yeldon, Chris Ivory kind of lost in the shuffle with the Jaguars trying to figure out who they are the first half of the season, but I would not panic on Allen Robinson. I still think Bortles and him work.
Okay, so at this point, we talked about the disappointments. Who's been your biggest fantasy star? We have some names like David Johnson, Ezekiel Elliott, Tom Brady, of course, when he came back from his suspension. These are names of guys who we expect to be phenomenal, and they have been. Who's your star for this first half of the season?
Well, I always think it's tough for a rookie to live up to lofty expectations, so I'm going to give it to Zeke. I think Ezekiel Elliott, from a consistency standpoint, they said he was going to do it. I know he's got the offensive line, but he's done it and then some. I think for Ezekiel Elliott to be drafted in that mid-first round and then to go out and perform and live up to all these expectations when all these running backs are missing in action due to this reason or that, either underperforming or hurt or on injured reserve. So I think Ezekiel Elliott definitely deserves all the attention positive in fantasy football this year. You know, the other thing is Le'Veon Bell, since he got back, I mean, Le'Veon Bell has lived up to those expectations too. So busy in the passing game. He doesn't have to score touchdowns to be fantasy relevant because he is such a big part of the passing game there in Pittsburgh, even without Roethlisberger, who miraculously is going to be back in like 2.5 weeks after the knee injury and surgery. So yeah, Le'Veon Bell, Ezekiel Elliott, those guys get the star for the first half of the season.
Okay, you touched on this earlier. I mean, we all look at this part of the season and think, man, if I could do it all over again, I would. And we look to those choices that we made in those first, second, third rounds. If you could go back in a 10-team standard scoring league and redraft that first round, who are some guys you would look at?
Yeah, now the key word in your question is standard scoring, and I think that's where those fifth-round running backs really move up the board. I mean, to pick up DeMarco Murray and Melvin Gordon, which was great value in August based on what was expected of them, and slide them into the first round, I think a lot of people will be really happy. With that said, I mean, Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson, Ezekiel Elliott, DeMarco, and Melvin Gordon, then you're really still sticking with Antonio Brown, A.J. Green, Julio Jones, who's dealing with an injury now, but we'll just look at his previous body of work. Gronk, I mean, it still makes sense in a standard scoring league that Gronk is somebody you would consider at the back end of the first round, because one of the most consistent players this year in terms of average points per game week in and week out, nobody really talks about him. It's Mike Evans. Mike Evans was drafted in the early second round of a lot of drafts, and he's been week in and week out one of the most consistent. Now, he didn't have a great game against the Oakland Raiders, but you look at the rest of his game logs, and Mike Evans has really lived up to those expectations. And to kind of take this one step further, if you're looking for some frisky trade action here towards the end of the season, look at Tampa Bay's schedule. Jameis Winston and Mike Evans, they get the Saints twice during the fantasy football playoffs. I know a lot of people at this juncture know that, but if you're watching this podcast and you're looking for some tips, take a look at the Buccaneers schedule. It's pretty soft.
Okay, well, if you're like me, you're fighting for a playoff spot at this point in one of my leagues at least. So let's talk about Week 9. There's a lot of questions for fantasy owners. Like last week, we have 6 teams on byes: the Bears, Patriots, Bengals, Cardinals, Redskins, and the Texans. So right there's a lot of big names that you won't have this week. In terms of guys that we can target on the waiver wire, I know a big question right now is surrounding Spencer Ware of the Chiefs, who went down with a concussion. He might not be in. And then Jamal Charles is dealing with that knee injury still. So one of the big waiver wire teams that we're looking at is the Chiefs.
Yeah, you know, when I did my fantasy recap on Sunday night after all the action, I actually created a grid, a table recapping RB3s and RB4s in the NFL, because we're getting to know them at this point. So, you know, when we're back in August and we're doing our draft, nobody's really looking at the RB3s and RB4s on NFL depth charts. And now they're fantasy relevant, not only buys, but all these injuries that you mentioned. I mean, look at where the Chiefs were at the beginning of the season. They had Jamal Charles, they had Spencer Ware, they had Charkandrick West, and they had Niall Davis. Niall Davis just got cut by the Packers. Wouldn't be shocked if he re-signed with the Chiefs this week. But yeah, Charkandrick West, I think, again, based on a necessity and based on those bye weeks, you look at the Jacksonville matchup, Charkandrick West is one guy that has done it before. So I think based on a necessity, he's going to, if again, Jamal Charles ailing knees and Dr. James Andrew visits just isn't ready for Week 9, you got to plug him in there. I mean, in some deeper leagues, I know Charkandrick West started last week for some teams because it was just the RB2 in the Chiefs offense, which we know can be used from time to time. The other confusing situation on the short week is there in Tampa Bay. You had Jacquizz Rodgers in a walking boot. So now you're down to Anton Smith. You might remember him from his days with the Falcons. And then Peyton Barber. They re-signed Mike James, who was a fantasy darling for a moment in time a few years ago. So, I mean, we're really getting to the nitty-gritty of these depth charts, and it's going to be splintered. I really think when you look at Tampa Bay, you look at Kansas City, and then not only that, the Saints have a little bit of a situation with Ingram getting benched. Last week, Tim Hightower comes in. I think that's a new running back by committee because they don't trust Ingram to hang on to the ball. And if you remember, at the end of last year, Hightower won a lot of people fantasy championships with his play in Week 16. Lots of new names being elevated due to necessity, due to injuries, because Jacquizz Rodgers, if you look at his physical stature, he wasn't built for 25-plus carries a game, and now he's really paying for it. So I think Charkandrick, I think Anton Smith, Peyton Barber, and Tim Hightower will be the most added names off the waiver wire this week at running back.
Okay, good stuff. We also always have a lot of questions about the quarterbacks. Of course, if you have Tom Brady, you're a very happy person. Derek Carr had an outstanding Week 8 with 513 yards and 4 touchdown passes. Is there any guy like that who you think is prime for a stellar Week 9?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're looking for bye week replacements for Brady, I mean, that's a huge hole to fill this week. And I think when you look at the fantasy ceiling of the guys still available on the waiver wire, you have to look, and no laughing, Colin Kaepernick. You know, Kaepernick might not throw for 300 yards, but he still can rush you for 60 to 70 yards based on where that 49ers team is right now. So I would look at CK7 as a bye week replacement at quarterback. Some other people have looked at Josh McCown. He's the best the Browns have right now, and the Cowboys are coming off an emotional win over the Eagles to win that division rivalry game, and now they have to go on the road, and the Browns do play well at home. I know they might not win a game, and that's possible, but fantasy points don't matter, or fantasy points don't care about win and loss record. They care about fantasy point totals, and Josh McCown can throw the ball around a little bit. Gary Barnidge, Terrell Pryor, they have looked, again, better with McCown in there than anybody else they've had. So I think CK7 is the one that I would stream in there over Josh McCown, but definitely some holes to fill at quarterback this week.
Okay, as far as wide receivers, Amari Cooper led the field last week for 173 yards, 12 receptions, and a touchdown. Which wide receiver in Week 9 is primed to have a great week?
Well, we get Roethlisberger back this week, so it wouldn't shock me if we saw Antonio Brown hit the radar again. It's so crazy to me that Roethlisberger is practicing already again. That guy's a freak of nature. He might not be able to walk when he's 50 years old, but for fantasy owners and for NFL fans, that guy has given it his all there in Pittsburgh, and that pains me to say as a Cleveland Browns guy. But, you know, I think when you're looking at the waiver wire for somebody that can maybe be that bye week replacement, I mean, you mentioned Alshon Jeffrey's on a bye, A.J. Green's on a bye. All of New England's toys are on a bye. The Cardinals are on a bye. That's a lot of wide receiver talent that is off the board. So you're really going to have to dig deep. I think Tyreek Hill there in Kansas City, to circle back to that team. Tyreek Hill has been, he scored in 3 out of his last 4 games. That's a potential replacement. And then again, it then does get a little dicey. I think wide receivers have been picked up and dropped so many times off the waiver wire this year that it is a little bit thin at wide receiver. But Tyreek Hill is the guy that really fascinates me because they're finding creative ways to use his speed in the Chiefs' offense. And that also means, and this is a good thing, they might work him out of the backfield because they are down to Charkandrick West as their main running back option. They might go Charkandrick and then a little Tyreek Hill, kind of like what the Packers did with Ty Montgomery a few weeks ago. So those are a couple names to know.
Okay, this is all really good stuff that you've given us. Is there anything for us to keep in mind as we head into Week 9 here?
Yeah, I think now is the time to start really planning and positioning yourself for the playoffs if you think you have a chance. And based on the leagues that I've been in, there's a lot of teams right on the cusp of making the playoffs and not. So I really think starting to think about those trades and not only playing for Week 9, but playing for Weeks 13, 14, 15, 16 as we get closer to the championship. And again, strategy changes a little bit if you're in a keeper league because you don't want to burn your future success just for some immediate chances at winning. But yeah, I think being smart and looking at those schedules. I did a video on Sunday about the strength of Tyrod Taylor this year, kind of flying under the radar. He's got a pretty soft playoff schedule. That's something we're looking at. I mentioned Tampa Bay. I think the Bears, look at what Jay Cutler did on Monday night against the Vikings. There seemed to be a little bit more click in there against the Vikings defense that had looked so good before their bye week. So look at Zach Miller. Look at Cameron Meredith. And then, of course, we know what Jordan Howard did. Start positioning yourselves based on that schedule weeks 13 through 16.
Okay, it's crunch time. Thanks so much, Ryan. And last thing, where can we find more from you?
Sure, you can get me on Twitter at Fox Sports Fowler. I answer all the questions there. And then, of course, we'll have all the fantasy content leading up to Week 9 at foxsports.com/fantasy.
Okay, good luck in Week 9, everyone. It's a tough one. You're going to need it.